Alrighty. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another week of the ConSci seminar series. Looks like we'll still probably have a few people trickle in, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. So before I introduce our speaker today, just a few housekeeping items. We'll have about a 45-minute talk and then probably 10 to 15 minutes for questions after that. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat as they come up, or hold them till the end. And if you're feeling brave, you can ask them to Kira directly. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Kira Cassidy. I've had the pleasure of working with Kira out in Yellowstone for the last 6 years, but she's worked there for quite a bit longer. She's been a research associate there since 2012, and then I think you started working there maybe back in like what, 2005, 2006?
07 was my first one.
07.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Awesome. So she grew up in Illinois and went to Southern Illinois University and majored in natural resource management. She then came over here to the U to do her master's with Dr. Dave Meach, where she studied wolf territoriality and aggression between different packs out in Yellowstone. Her current projects in Yellowstone focus on analyzing wolf pack behavior and social structure, and also on effective science communication. So with that, Kira, take it away.
Thanks, Jack. Just going to share my screen real quick. So, Jack, thank you, first of all, for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to talking about this particular project because, well, Jack asked me to talk about this one. I think he's heard me talk about it maybe daily for the last year and a half or so. It's a massive collaboration, one of the biggest collaborations that I've been a part of. And so I'll get to all of the parks that were involved in this in a little bit, but just kind of wanted to start off describing the, let me see if I can get rid of some of these. I wanted to talk about how this project came to be and kind of how that seed formed, how the questions started originally, because I think it's a really fun part about science that it often just, the questions come to you in kind of like a gee whiz fashion, particularly studying a wild animal in a place like Yellowstone where we can't really do experiments. So we're not setting up, you know, kind of like an experimental design, but getting as close as we can, controlling as many things as we can in a wild system. So big job there. When wolves were delisted or taken off the endangered species list in Idaho and Montana in 2009, both states decided to have a hunting season. And of course, Yellowstone borders both of those states. And so we knew that there would likely be some transboundary movements and some losses due to the hunting seasons. It happened pretty quickly. So I think the hunting season opened in early to mid-September. And within just a few weeks, 4 members of the Cottonwood Creek Pack were shot north of Yellowstone. And they had only entered the hunting season with, I think, 7 adults and 5 pups. And so 4 adults were shot. That left only a handful of pack members. We only saw them a few more times before they completely disappeared. Likely the pups died because they were only, 5 months old or so. And then the adults apparently went somewhere else, possibly died, possibly joined other packs, possibly dispersed. So that pack dissolved. We had a new pack form in that area about 6 or 8 months later, and the same thing happened the next hunting season, which was in 2011. And so I was in 2009, I was a technician, as Jack mentioned. So I was living in Yellowstone, out in the field every day, collecting data. And my boss, supervisor Doug Smith, was watching this and kind of thinking, okay, this is a new paradigm for wolves in the Yellowstone area because of the delisting and now hunting. Is this a pattern? So it's one of those kind of like, gee, I wonder what's going on here. I wonder, does this happen a lot? Is this going to be something that's very rare? What things affect what we're seeing here where a pack is dissolving? Of course, we'd seen packs dissolve before, but it was usually pretty rare. They were pretty stable on the landscape. Some of them are in Yellowstone, for decades. The longest one right now is 27 years. The second longest, I think, is 21 years at this point. And so having a pack dissolve is not something that happens super often, but we need to quantify it, of course, if we want to ask questions like that. And so when that second pack dissolved, here we go. When that second pack dissolved, it kind of felt like, okay, we need to keep better track of this. And at the time we were, when I say we, this is Yellowstone, because I had left to actually come to graduate school and study territoriality. And so we need to keep better track of this. Doug, who's my supervisor, had a pretty close relationship with biologists in Denali National Park, so another park with a pretty intensive wolf monitoring program with radio collaring and everything, and asked them, do you guys see the same thing? Because there was this little slice in the Denali area where there was hunting and trapping allowed, and a lot of the park packs traveled to the same place. So trying to find a similar scenario to ask similar questions. This expanded over the next few years. Oops, sorry, don't want a laser. This expanded over the next few years to a handful of other parks that we talked to. So Denali and Yellowstone, of course, kind of at the very beginning there, and then Yukon-Charlie Rivers, another really large park on the border of the Yukon and Alaska, became involved. Yukon-Charlie actually has predator control going on around the boundary of the park. And so there was at least one instance where a pack of 24 wolves that was monitored by the park spent most of their time in, actually it's a national preserve, went out of the preserve and were completely, every single one was shot. And so kind of a lot of human caused mortality there, not the hunting season, of course, but human caused. And then we also brought on Grand Teton National Park and Voyageurs National Park. And this gave us this really cool kind of spread across wolf range in North America. So the 2 parks in Alaska, 2 parks in the Rocky Mountains, and then 1 park in the Midwest. And they're all Canis lupus, of course, they're all gray wolves, but the question was related to these protected areas. And we wanted to know basically human caused mortality and how that impacts, what level is that going on in the protected areas for people that are studying wolves pretty intensely there. And then also how that human caused mortality is impacting the pack, because a lot of people have studied population level impacts of human caused mortality on wolves. And there's a lot of really good publications that are well cited and are used a lot in state management, but we wanted to go to a different scale. I'm getting a tiny bit ahead of myself. And so I just want, hopefully you guys can see this, the names here. And so I just wanted to throw out a thank you to all of the co-authors on this huge project, Bridget Borg and Kaya Clowder at Denali, Matt Sorum at Yukon-Charlie, Voyageurs National Park, Steve Windell's and Voyageurs Wolf Project, Dr. Joe Bump, who I saw is on here, and then also Tom Gable and Austin Humkes, Grand Teton National Park, Sarah Dewey, John Stevenson, and Becca Thomas Kuzilik, and then the handful of people in Yellowstone, Doug, Dan Staler, and myself. So just a little bit of a summary of each of the parks, and I don't want to go into a ton of detail about each of the parks because a lot of you have probably been to most of these and you know kind of the general vibe, you know, how big it is, how many visitors there are, how you can travel across it. So I'll just go through this very quickly, but I want you for each of these parks to think about, if you were a wolf living in one of these parks, how protected is it truly? You know, is it even possible to live your entire life within the park? For a place like Grand Teton, it's really not. They track about 4 or 5 packs that live somewhere around 50 to 80% of their time within the park boundaries. So there's a lot of movement outside of the park boundary. There's also a lot of roads for how big it is, and a ton of people for how big it is, certainly. Yellowstone, while much bigger than Grand Teton, has quite a lot of road as well. And then also tons of visitors, of course. Those are concentrated in the kind of June, July, August, September months, of course. One thing that Yellowstone and Grand Teton have in common, I just wanted to point this out for these Rocky Mountain parks, is that they have seasonal wildlife migrations. Like most parks, their boundaries are imperfect, but they both had this really long period of wolf absence, so about 70 to 80 years where there were no wolves. And that is not the case for voyagers, especially. They still had wolves even when there were only a couple hundred left in the entire lower 48 states. And then Alaska never had wolves eradicated, although they were brought down to pretty low numbers at different times in different areas, but never eradicated from the entire area around the protected parks that we're focusing on, Denali and Yukon-Charlie. So Voyager's also one of the smaller parks, although, you know, in the National Park System, Park Service system, it's still pretty large compared to a lot of the small units that are out there. For this study, it's one of the smaller ones. Hardly any roads, which is pretty amazing, but a lot of travel by water, of course, and 240,000 visitors or so per year. Denali is the largest park in the study here at over 6 million acres, almost 3 times larger than Yellowstone. So for those of you that have been to Yellowstone, but not Denali, it's absolutely massive. It has one real long road, 150 kilometers, but only 24 kilometers of it are open to the public. And so beyond that, it's only the shuttle buses that you can take, which is pretty obvious. I'll show the breakdown of morts in a little bit here, but in Denali, in close to 30 years of research, they've only had one wolf hit by a car on that road. 600,000 visitors per year. Keep in mind, a lot of those are on those shuttle buses. Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve, 0 roads, pretty amazing. So it's only one that you either paddle or fly into. Pretty large, larger than Yellowstone, and 1,200 visitors per year. Those are mostly people going down the river. What all of the parks have in common is that they all monitor and track wolves pretty intensively, putting out radio collars, sometimes then tracking with a tracking plane overhead or doing ground observations. And at least some of the parks are using trail cameras with a lot of success. And so part of this, actually kind of the crux of this whole question is, how do the morts affect pack level metrics? Relies on finding those radio collared wolves when they've died and determining how they've died. And so all 5 parks together over all of the time periods, and I can do the details on the time periods later because each park had different years. The earliest one was Denali with 1986. And I think it was 118 years total for all the parks put together, 978 mortalities. Now, I think this is a really important point to make. So we are collaring, each of these parks are collaring a handful of wolves in each pack, but of course not every pack member is collared generally. And that information about individuals is used to learn about population level metrics. This is really common in research on social animals. So you collar a handful of the individuals and then learn about kind of the entire population as a whole. But that does kind of ignore this middle scale of the pack. And that's really hard to do unless you're monitoring very intensively, ideally even getting observational data. And so seeing the pack mates that aren't collared and being able to recognize or have composition, have pack size pretty regularly, and knowing it's the same pack, essentially. And so at first I didn't know where to put this in my talk, but I really like it here because I just brought in this idea of the difference between a population level study, so asking questions about things like survival, reproduction, mortality, dispersal and immigration and emigration. And so the difference between that and a pack level metric, how big packs get, what their composition is, whether they persist on the landscape or dissolve, kind of that very first slide that I showed when this study, the idea for this study really came about. The difference here is that most people focus on population level metrics, which is great. And I mean, wildlife research is hard enough. If you can get information on that, then you're doing a really great job. But animals, especially social animals, are operating at this group level often. And so we can't just ignore that part of it. This ties into this organic act for the National Park Service because wildlife are held to a no impairment standard. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the population is not impacted, or does that mean that the group level is not impacted or impaired? It's not super well defined, and I think everyone, even in the Park Service, would admit that. And that's probably done on purpose because it needs to be kind of up to interpretation, maybe even at the park level. So maybe even not even the Park Service level. There was another publication by the NPS that came out in 2011, further describing park resources as things that include ecological, biological, and physical processes. And I underlined ecological and biological here because biological processes are also a very kind of vague term that haven't been defined. But part of my goal in this paper that I'm talking about is that biological processes should not only include population level metrics, things like survival and reproduction, but also group level metrics. It's a biological process that wolves need in order to be, unimpaired. So I kind of went over this. Population level research is occurring at those vital rates that a lot of people are doing a ton of great work on and have already published on, especially related to wolves. Some of these studies have shown that wolves can withstand pretty high levels of human-caused mortality before it starts to affect the population growth rate. And the most common one cited is this Lane Adam ones at the very top in Alaska, where it showed that about 29% of human-caused mortality is the level at which wolves will the population growth rate will start to actually drop. And so once again, there's these three levels: the individual level, the population level, and the pack level that we should be paying attention to, not only population. That brings us to the research questions for this particular topic. We wanted to know, kind of bringing all these things together, that difference of scale and the Park Service Organic Act, what is the extent of human-caused mortality? So we just wanted to tally it up and get it out there. And then also, does that human-caused mortality impact those pack level biological processes, persistence, and reproduction? And I'll get into the first one first. We divided up these are all collared wolves, by the way, because you can't compare natural versus human-caused mortality, including uncollared wolves. I did for later parts of this analysis, but not for this one, because the chances that you're finding uncollared natural caused mortalities is almost zero. And uncollared human caused mortalities, finding those ones is pretty common. So you can see that there's a big difference here in the number of human caused mortalities, that's in red, for each of the parks. Some of them are pretty high, over half for Yukon Charlie and Grand Teton. Voyagers was close at half. And then for Yellowstone and Yellowstone and Denali, it was pretty low, but that does correlate really well with the amount of time that those packs spend in the park versus out. So in Yellowstone, for example, wolves are spending about 96% of their time within the park boundaries, and that shows in this. So the number of human-caused mortalities is 22%. Of course, it's not the 4% that they're out of the park, but we wouldn't necessarily expect that to be exactly the case. So if you take all of the human-caused mortalities, so that was just the red bar there, plus the uncollared human-caused mortalities, and divided them out by more specific causes by park, you can see that there's actually quite a bit of variation by park here. And notice the sample sizes, so some of that can play a big part here. But for Denali and Yellowstone, a lot of those human-caused mortalities were from harvests, so that's going outside of the protected area boundaries. Yukon Charlie, of course, that orange portion is lethal control. That's where I mentioned the the state was doing, wolf eradication as part of an effort to bring up the caribou herds in the area. And that's going on in a lot of places still, not around Yukon Charlie, but a lot of places in Canada. And then Grand Teton National Park actually had the highest proportion from vehicle strikes. So that was a little bit surprising, but I've been down to Grand Teton a number of times, and the speed limit is 55 in a lot of the places through the park. And I think just that difference, as opposed to Denali and Yellowstone, other driving parks where the speed limit's usually pretty low, this one's pretty quick. And then Voyagers had a pretty equal split considering the sample size for all of those different causes of mortality. And then I threw all of the parks together, of course, just to see what it looks like. And harvest and lethal account for over 80%. So that was just kind of, tallying up the extent of human caused mortality for wolves that use national parks. Some of them for, hardly ever leave, some of them leave a bit. And so that definitely plays a part in how many of those human caused mortalities there were, but we weren't trying to come up with any kind of rate of that thing. So we just wanted to know the extent. The biggest question we had was, do those human caused mortalities impact those biological processes of packs persisting on the landscape and also packs reproducing? And this is reproducing at the pack level. So we weren't necessarily following a single wolf in the pack, trying to figure out if she was reproducing. But this is if in the pack, if that wolf that reproduced 1 year died, we're just looking to see if another one in the pack reproduces the next year. So even though it seems like it might be a measure at the individual level, we were treating it one step backwards to that pack level. The information we need to answer a question like this, thankfully, all of the parks had some really great information on when packs started and when packs dissolved, or if they were maybe still present at the time that we were putting this data together. So when the questions came up, remember I mentioned 2009, 2011 as kind of that seed was planted, took a few years to bring in all of the rest of the parks. Now all of a sudden there's 5 of us working together. We can actually go back in time, some of the parks back to the 1980s and look to see, okay, this is the information that we have on when a pack formed, when a pack dissolved. This is when we know that they had pups or not. And I can just zoom in a little bit here on some of the Yellowstone packs. So we can put a line here for each biological year on April 1st, was the pack present? And then were they present the very next April 1st? So through the entire biological year. We then looked at the mortalities that we'd recorded. So of those 900, and I think it was 78 mortalities for all the parks, all the packs. And if we know the pack of the wolf, that was key, knowing which pack a wolf was from when it died. We put that X into the biological year and the pack year that we knew that it was a member. And so then now all of a sudden we know for each pack, how many pack years they were present for, when they dissolved, or which pack year that they dissolved, and also how many mortalities they had in each one of those pack years. And just a quick note, we also had if the wolf was a breeder or not. In Yellowstone, we have some subordinate breeders, and so we actually used leader versus not. So we only wanted those 2 most dominant wolves, ideally. So we then tallied up the different types of packs, whether a pack had no human caused mortalities in that pack year. So from April 1st to April 1st, did we record any human caused mortalities for this pack? If no, they go into the green bar here. And if yes, if there was at least one of the X's there, they went into the orange bars here. And then we did this for each park. Pack and park keeps screwing me up here. But we did this for each park. And so you can see that the relationship between the packs that had no human caused mortalities recorded versus the packs that had at least one human caused mortality recorded is basically the same. The packs that had no human caused mortalities were more likely to persist through that biological year than packs that had at least one mortality. That relationship was the same for every park. And when you combine all 5 parks and do some, just Z tests comparing population proportions, it was a significant difference there. We did the same thing with reproduction. Again, the same type of relationship here, where the packs that had no human-caused mortalities were more likely to reproduce than the packs that didn't. It's of course a little bit depressed compared to the packs that persist, because a pack can persist and not reproduce, but a pack can't reproduce if it's not persisting. Once again, the Z-score here for the comparison of the population proportions for reproducing those 2 types of packs was significant difference. Okay, so that's great, but that's kind of just like a univariate analysis, and we want to know what other things do we need to control for, first of all, and what other things might be influencing the probability that a pack persists or reproduces. And so we included year and pack ID as random intercepts. In all of these things, we compared the null models to a handful of other models, including one that was actually just pack size, because we know how important pack size is to the success of a pack. And it would make sense that one that's doing better would be in a larger pack, at least to a certain point. And so we compared a bunch of different models. The best one for pack persistence ended up being one that included 3 variables: pack size, the total number of mortalities, and if those mortalities were a leader or a breeder. It ended up the same with reproduction, so same 3 variables. What we were able to do is take that best performing model then and use it to predict the probability that a pack persists based on the pack size on the x-axis there, and also the number of mortalities that the pack has, including the leader mortalities. And so I only threw up the black line here because this is the probability that a pack will persist from April 1st to April 1st if they have no human-caused mortalities recorded, based on all of the data that we input from those. I think it ended up being 864 pack years, 193 different packs from all 5 parks. So you can see here that the probability that a pack persists is about 8 out of 10 for the very tiniest packs of only 2. But then it goes up and it kind of levels out, and it's almost guaranteed for packs that are, 12, maybe 10, 12 plus or so. So the probability that a pack is going to be around from one year to the next, especially for those large packs, is pretty high. And that's what we were seeing on the ground. However, I added all these lines at once. If you start adding in mortalities, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are those yellow through purple lines. And then if those mortalities are leaders, especially, those are the blue lines near the bottom, then you start to see this impact of human-caused mortality. And let's just use 10 as an example. This is the average pack size in Yellowstone. And so with no human-caused mortalities, that's where the line crosses the black line at the top. The probability that a pack survives or persists from April 1st to April 1st is going to be, it was somewhere around 94%. And then you can see, like, as you add those mortalities in, that drops more and more. Interestingly, the loss of 5 non-leader wolves is equal to about the loss of 1 leader wolf at that pack size. And then you can see they kind of follow each other across the graph here. And so they're seemingly approximately equal across a lot of pack sizes. But if they lost both leaders, then their probability of persisting drops below 50-50. So kind of an interesting effect there, showing the loss of a leader versus the other types of wolves. And I put another line here at 5.5 because I think hopefully the part of the benefit of doing this whole analysis and then getting it published soon will be that other people who don't have this level of data, this kind of detail of packs forming here and dissolving here, and we know they're still around here, and this wolf that died is actually from this pack, but this one is not. people who don't have that level of detail still might be able to take this predicted graph and say, okay, in this area, I'm going to use Montana for an example. They've published a lot how their average pack size is somewhere around 5 or 6. And so I drew this little line here at 5.5. So they hopefully will be able to take a publication like this and say, okay, the packs in Montana live in groups of about 5.5. And so if we follow this line with no human caused mortality, their probability is about 9 out of 10 our packs are going to make it through each year. But with certain numbers of human caused mortality, and part of the goal is about a 40% decrease in certain areas of Montana for wolf hunting especially. And so let's say wolves live in a pack of somewhere around 5, killing 40% of them is 2. And so 2 wolves, let's say they're not leaders, then you would go to kind of that light orange line. Okay, so the pack, if they're not leaders, and those are the 2 that were harvested, then the pack is still going to persist about 80% of the time. But if they were both of the leaders, now the probability that that pack persists is about 25% or 0.25 to get through the year. And so hopefully managers will be able to use this to kind of set some goals or and just use it for decision making in the future. We did the same thing. Notice that the y-axis here says reproducing now. So same exact thing with reproducing. Take the best performing model and get these predicted outputs. And it's of course a little bit lower than persisting, as we showed with the real data from all of the parks. And so a pack that's about 2 wolves reproduces. A pack of 2 wolves that's present on April 1st will reproduce the next year. So this is 365 days later, reproduce the next year about 60% of the time. And then that slowly increases through all of these pack sizes. Again, putting in each of these mortalities up to 5, and then the leader mortalities as well shows that drop in the probability that they reproduce. And the same thing here, just a line at 10 shows that a pack will reproduce about 8 out of 10 times each year. A pack that's present on April 1st will reproduce the next year 8 out of 10 times. Unless they start losing a bunch of wolves, if they lose 2 leaders, their probability is about 0.4 or so. But of course, it's not 0, even though they lost both leaders, because usually they'll have other wolves take over those leadership positions by that following year. A pack of 5.5, once again, this is just a line on there because this is about the average pack size of wolves that don't live in the protected areas in the Rocky Mountains. And so it's kind of the system that I know best. Packs of about that size will reproduce about 7 out of 10 times, unless they start losing leaders. And they are probably doing that because the hunting seasons have been some recent legislation and recent changes to hunting seasons to make them more liberal. And so with increased wolves being harvested, then you'll start to see wolves or packs operating at kind of these colorful lines instead of the black line. Hopefully this will be used in some management decisions. I'm not even necessarily saying to get back up to the black line. That's 0 human caused mortalities is probably not a realistic goal for anybody, even in a national park. But maybe getting a little bit closer to it than packs dissolving every year would be a nice goal. I do want to point out quickly the importance of pack size and composition. A lot of these studies have been done in the Yellowstone area, but then also Isle Royale as well, showing how important pack size is for wolves. And it's not always just that bigger is better. For some pack sizes, there is kind of like this crux where something in a wolf life history is most efficient or most effective, and then it actually decreases with a larger pack size. Reproducing is one of those, maybe a little bit surprisingly, not pup survival, but reproducing. So packs that live in pack sizes of about 8 will produce kind of the peak number of pups per female. But beyond that, there's a little bit too much competition, and so they won't produce quite as many pups. Things like hunting elk are similar. So a pack of about 4 is the most efficient elk hunting size, and beyond that is not really very helpful at all. Hunting bison is most efficient between 9 and 13 pack members, and beyond that, it might actually increase slightly, but it doesn't increase as steeply. And so pack size, interestingly, plays, I mean, we might expect this, of course, but it's cool to see it quantified, how important it is in kind of all parts of wolf life history. And this is just saying the exact same thing here and listing a few other specific studies: competing with scavengers, recovering from disease. And I think a few of these things that we should consider, oops, let me go back here real quick. A few of these things to consider is that if humans are decreasing wolf pack size, then it may actually be influencing how effective wolves are at doing these different things. I think the best example right now is that increased harvests in Montana, decreasing pack size, which is part of the goal of Montana, is, you know, reducing the number of wolves, and part of that is reducing pack sizes. But for wolves that live in this Yellowstone area that hunt bison, it actually, decreasing their pack size makes them less efficient at hunting bison. A lot of the packs might be, if they're exposed to hunting pressure outside the park, might be going into the hunting season at about 15 wolves. Let's say they come out of it at about 10. Just that drop might make them a little bit less efficient at some of those things that require large pack sizes, like hunting bison, like competing with other packs, competing with scavengers. And so just an interesting thing to think about. No one has actually brought all of these kinds of things together in kind of like a meta-analysis. But all of them, if we consider all of them in a list like this, I think it may be important for management in the future, especially as it relates to wolves in the Rockies, because there's this, is it a wolf elk system, or in Yellowstone, is it a wolf elk bison system? And if people would prefer it to be a wolf elk bison system, then we should be kind of promoting those larger packs, or at least trying to not drive that pack size down. So what can we do about this? So now we know that there are impacts to the packs at that pack level based on the human-caused mortalities. A lot of this, as you know, the harvest and lethal control accounted for 80% of the mortalities that we recorded. And so this requires a ton of interagency communication, a ton of compromise. You know, there's not going to be wolf hunting inside of any of these protected, or, you know, most of these protected areas. There are sometimes in the preserves for subsistence hunting, but that's it. And so the compromise is going to happen right along the boundary outside of the protected area. And this actually was pretty successful this year in the Yellowstone, Montana, you know, that shared boundary, where last year there was no quota in the area that had had a quota, I think for over a decade or so, usually a quota of somewhere between 2 and 4. It changed a few times over the years, but last year, no quota, and 21 wolves were harvested right in these kind of small zones north of Yellowstone. And this year, when the commission voted on the hunting regulations, they actually reinstated a quota and put it at 6. And so it was a little bit higher than it was in the previous recent years besides last year. But it still seems like a decent, or at least a step in the right direction for compromise dealing with transboundary management. The last thing that I want to mention here is that parks can also do a lot of things to prevent human-caused mortalities within park borders. It doesn't always just have to be they're great in the park, so what do we do when they're out of the park? That's not necessarily the case here, because there was still almost 20% of those mortalities that happened inside of park boundaries. And so preventing vehicle strikes is a big one. This is a big topic across the world, really. Lowering speed limits, crossing structures. There's not many crossing structures at all, except in Wyoming in some of the migration corridors, but not in the national parks. preventing poaching, I don't want to say this is going to make a huge difference, but it's at least an effort put forwards. Law enforcement are pretty regularly understaffed and underfunded. And so if they had more of those things, they might be able to prevent more poaching instances, and then also increasing penalties for poaching. There was a wolf a number of years ago that was poached outside of Gardner, Montana, where I live, and the person got a $135 fine. So that doesn't really seem like enough to make it something that people are really considering as kind of like a major penalty. And also hazing habituated wolves. Habituated wolves are ones that have kind of lost their natural fear of people. And this is, of course, on a spectrum. So some of them are okay 300 meters from people and will still cross the road. And then other ones, like the wolf at the bottom here, will just walk by at just a few meters away from a vehicle. They might be a little bit more timid still of people, but maintaining wild behavior is key. And we don't talk about this quite as much as we probably should. If the wolves are getting used to people and vehicles, then it's much more likely that they'll be killed from any one of these more specific causes, being hit by a car, being hunted, being having to be removed through a control action because they depredated on, they were like, say, maybe getting into someone's chicken coop or something. The ones that keep that wild behavior are much less likely to cause people problems and to die from a human cause. So to wrap up, back to this figure, just another plug for this, great effort to keep wolves radio collared, studying them at the individual level. It's part of what I love most about my job. Being able to follow a wolf throughout its entire life is a pretty amazing opportunity to learn not only about the population and really interesting metrics and vital rates, but also what's occurring at the pack level. And this is the way that wolves see the world. And so I think that it's important for us to kind of make an attempt when managing them to see it that way too. Thank you so much. I know I have a huge list of thank yous here, but thanks to Jack for the invitation to come today. Happy to take questions.
Great. Thanks again, Kira, for an awesome talk. It looks like we already have one in the chat from Hunter. I don't know if you're able to see it. If not, I can help mediate that.
Let's see here. Oops. Oh yeah, here we go. It says, when collecting harvest data, did you consider legal harvest only, or was poaching also included into the same category? Great question. I'm wondering if hunters and or poachers may tend to avoid shooting collared wolves, especially poachers, and may skew your number of wolves killed due to harvest. That's a great question. So harvest and poaching was separated out. Poaching is the category that I would say has to be considered to be the minimum. When we say we're tallying up the extent of human caused mortalities, certainly there are some that were poached that were never found. And probably part of that is that poachers would be less likely to shoot a collared wolf. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so, yeah, I think that there could be a little bit of this should be considered a minimum. And maybe that's the best way to deal with it. There were a handful of packs in the pack year data, from April 1st to April 1st. Did they have a mortality, human caused mortality or not during that pack year? There were a handful of packs that I actually censored out of that analysis because I didn't know for sure if they did. And there's actually no way to know for sure, right? The way that we're measuring that, we can either say, yes, they did, or no, there was nothing recorded. And so that's why when I was kind of reporting that, I kept saying no recorded human caused mortalities. And so there were probably a handful of cases in our analysis where we had a pack that had a human caused mortality that was never recorded, and it was tallied as a pack year with no human caused mortality. I think we had enough data and enough really rigorous data from all of the parks to say that probably didn't happen a ton. And those ones that I censored out, it was like a pack that we had no radio collars, that lived on the border of Yellowstone, that we would only see maybe a handful of times a year, or confirm, okay, they had pups this year, but that's all we know about them. I actually took that one out of the analysis because they could have been, and likely, based on some evidence that we had outside the park, they could have been exposed to human-caused mortalities every year, and we just didn't have enough information on them to know. And so we used some of our best information and censored a few packs that there were too many unknowns with their variables. I see another question here from Rebecca. How often do you see habituated wolves in the park? My understanding is that it's not that common of an occurrence. Our methods to deal with habituated wolves similar to habituated grizzly bears. Good question there. So one of our technicians, Taylor Bland Raby, she actually presented on this at a recent wolf conference, and I loved her presentation. I hope that maybe she'll do one of these at some point, Jack. I'll just put a plug in for that.
Yeah, I'll try and talk her into it.
Okay, she can answer tons of questions about habituation and how it happens. We estimate that it's somewhere between 5 to 10% of the wolves in the park are kind of on the spectrum of habituation, in the, like, we're tolerant of people kind of zone. It's very rare for them to get to be a problem. I think it's only happened twice in almost 28 years where a wolf was actually lethally removed because they were way too habituated, running up to people, grabbing things, their backpack, tearing it apart. Habituated wolves that are just tolerant of people and maybe kind of nonchalant, will cross the road, no problem, kind of linger on the road. It's not that they're necessarily a danger to humans, but they're more of a danger, like they might get killed, as I mentioned. And we also don't want people to feed them. So if a wolf's nonchalant about being 5 meters away from a person, it's very easy for someone to just throw a Slim Jim out and for that wolf to eat it. And all of a sudden now it's a problem because now it's seeking out a food reward. And so to prevent kind of seeing wolves get to that tolerant behavior, in order to scoot them back towards wild behavior or skittish of people, we do use different things. Paintballs are kind of our go-to if the behavior is already kind of dramatic. But then also there's the bear management team will help us out, and they'll come out with bean bags, rubber bullets, cracker shells. Cracker shells seem to work really well if a wolf can be caught doing something bad. That's almost the hardest part about this habituated wolf thing, because you have to catch them in the act. They're very smart, so they will associate, I was walking down the road and most people just drive on by me, but all of a sudden, oop, there's a paintball, and then the sky is all of a sudden fireworks. Not actual fireworks, but the sound of the aerial bombs. And so they learn. Taylor's talk has a great example of a wolf that we thought was going to have to be lethally removed. He was being really bad. He stole a tripod. He was walking right up to people. He'd been bear sprayed, even shot with a paintball a bunch of times. And then after a huge effort over a few weeks, he changed his behavior completely. And he's now, I think she used the words model citizen. He has not gone anywhere near the road. None of us have seen him near the road. His pack actually lives, maybe purposefully, fairly far away from the road for the last 2 years now, I think it's been almost. And so it is sometimes just a personality thing, and then also an age thing. When they're yearlings, they kind of seem to push boundaries a little bit. And if they can get through that and learn that humans are not worth going anywhere near, then it's the best case scenario for them and us.
Great. And then Kira, I actually had a couple
Yeah.
questions that you may or may not have answers to at the moment. Maybe that's a plan for a future study. So I'm curious about this difference between the effects of, say, a specific wolf dying through human-caused mortality, hunting, vehicle strikes, versus something like territoriality, interpack aggression. So I'm wondering if this is maybe more at the population level, if there's, say, human-caused mortality is compensatory with something like territoriality. If you have higher rates of human-caused mortality, does that cause a decline in interpack aggression? And then do you know the demographic compositions differences between those two in like interpack disputes? Is it more likely for younger wolves to die versus similar things in hunting? I'm just curious about like how that effect might play out when we
Yeah,
look at that. If they just kind of have the same effect if, say, a leader dies from one cause versus another cause.
really good questions. You're right. Those would be very interesting next steps for this kind of a project. And also tying in some other things that we've discussed, other
Yeah,
cause specific mortalities for different age groups. Um, the idea of compensatory mortality for human cause mortality mostly or specifically, I think it makes a lot of sense that it would have an impact, kind of like the seesaw impact on natural cause mortality, which is mostly wolf on wolf fights.
yeah,
Fewer wolves out there is likely going to lead to fewer wolf-wolf aggressive interactions and mortalities. It's tough to say with our data. I've wanted to look at this, but I've never really trusted that the number of interactions we see is like a reliable metric of the interactions that are going on out there,
for
because,
sure. Yeah,
we see the handful of packs that the road is open all winter, and we see a lot of them during our winter studies. Great, but what ones are we missing? Are Even if it's like, at one point I tried to figure out how many exactly are we missing, or how many do we see? And just based on the number of fights, wolf-wolf fights that we saw, and the collared wolves that we saw killed, I think it was like 16 or 17 over the almost 28 years. And the number of wolves that we have found dead, just their collar went into mortality and we hiked out and found them. It was about 1 out of every 10 that we actually saw killed. And so I figured a very coarse way of thinking about it, that is, we see 1 out of every 10 aggressive fights between packs. So maybe that's kind of one way of measuring that. But the human caused mortality part of it is really interesting. And then the different ages too. I haven't looked at that exactly. I looked at it a little bit for a different talk I gave at the Wolf Conference, where a wolf that dies when it's either a pup or a yearling has a 40%, it was close to 40% chance of dying from humans. And a wolf that dies when it's 6 plus only dies from humans. It was like 0.18 proportion. So 18%
yeah,
or 17%, I think it was. And so it was about half. And so it seemed like the wolves that live past those first few years of life do seem to learn pretty well that humans aren't something that we want to stick around. But the hunting seasons can kind of confound this pretty well, I think, because I've heard of people taking shots at wolves that are 800, 900 yards away. And so it kind of doesn't matter how much a wolf has learned, how long it's lived, how skittish it is, how habituated it's ever been in its life, if someone's hunting it from 900 yards away. And so great questions. And I think that we would actually see a pattern if we dove deep into it. And it might be a really cool thing to look at like next summer or something.
yeah.
But I think there's also going to be this interesting interaction with just how people are hunting out there.
Great. And then it doesn't look like I see any more questions in the chat. Again, if you have them, drop them in, or feel free to unmute yourself. Maybe give it a minute or two.
I was going to throw a video at the end here of you walking next to a wolf, the videos that Connor put together,
Oh, yeah.
like
It
overlaid
looks
on top of each other.
like we might have a question from someone in the chat.
Yep. On the predicted persistence and reproduction graphs, is the pack size pre or post the given number of mortalities? Excellent question. It is pre. So let me see if I can even go back to one of these. So I took pack size at the fall count. Yellowstone does a fall count. I'll go to the persistence one. Yellowstone does an official fall count, and the rest of the parks, and Voyagers did an official fall count as well. And then the other parks, the 2 Alaska parks, that's when they do their official count, like right before the winter season. And so I took that pack size it seemed to be the one that was the most reasonable to include in the model. I tested for, the difference between using the spring size versus fall size versus midwinter. Midwinter didn't make any sense because about half the wolves had been harvested prior to that and half were harvested after it. And so I wanted to capture as close as you could to right at the beginning of the human caused mortalities. So that was just before. And this, we're actually, just as a little update, I normally wouldn't share this, but it's really far along. This paper, I just finished the 2nd round of revisions on it, and it's with co-authors right now. We're probably going to send it back in a week or so. And then hopefully I'll be able to send it around to everybody after that. So it's been a really fun collaboration. I haven't worked, like I said, with many groups of co-authors this large. And so that was definitely a learning experience. And I'm excited to see, you don't see very many papers where it's 5, one agency and 5 different units all working together. So I'm pretty excited for that.
Yeah, it's super cool to see that mix too, like across the country. That's awesome.
It's also really neat to see, how similar the persistence and reproduction rates were throughout every park. And you'd think, okay, maybe should it be different? But these are all Canis lupus. And so it just really made me feel like, okay, well, Canis lupus has a huge range and we're studying them in all these different places. We might expect some of these things to be different, and they really weren't, surprisingly.
Yeah. Yeah, very different systems. But great. Well, if we don't have, oh no, let's see, we just got one more thrown in the chat.
Last minute
keep
question. Were there any difficulties working with such a large group across different parts of the US? Were there conflicts or was it smooth sailing? Of course, it's not always total smooth sailing, but no paper is absolutely smooth sailing. It was, I think the hardest part was actually getting data sharing stuff. And that's not about any particular parks or people, but because this had to do with cross-boundary management, I think everyone was rightfully kind of worried about, is this going to be something that's extremely critical of not only the Park Service, but also agencies that we have to share boundaries with. And we ended up writing it in a way that I really liked, and I think everyone was really happy with, where it's really just kind of a call for collaboration. And it's not critical of any particular agencies, and hopefully people can actually use the information to make science-based management decisions. And so in the end, I think everybody's pretty proud of it, which is nice. And it took a lot of collaboration to get there, and hopefully it will mean more collaboration in the future.
Great. Well, thanks again, Kira. It looks like we're right at time. So yeah, thanks for joining, everybody. And look forward to seeing you guys again next week.